If your child has started at a new school this September, whether primary or secondary, and your life has gone into meltdown, then this week's episode is essential for you. My last episode was about helping children transition back to school from the summer holidays. But I know that when your child is starting a new school phase transition, there are very specific and sometimes quite intense difficulties that you can face. I want to share with you some tips that will help make things a little easier. So carry on watching, because what happens in these next few weeks can impact the rest of the school year. Welcome to the Zen Parent Survival Guide podcast. My name is Esther Freeman, and I teach parents the techniques and principles from how my daughter went from 5 or 6 violent meltdowns a day to virtually 0. Through this weekly podcast, you can learn how to have a calmer family life. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. When my daughter moved from nursery to primary school, our life became a living nightmare. Her violence and aggression went up to a whole new level. It was horrendous, and we struggled to get her into school. So she did eventually get in, so I suppose I can't call it outright school refusal, but she was definitely avoidant, and it was all anxiety driven. Sometimes it would take us hours to get there. And one of the biggest challenges for me was that once she was there, she went into masking mode. So all the teachers would say, well, she's just fine. And so I was dismissed, I was patronized, and I was just told to stop worrying because everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. The minute I picked her up, she would just explode into a meltdown. Her physical health deteriorated from all the stress and all the holding in she did all day. And she was just in such a terrible state, just all round. And actually, when I really pushed the teachers, I started to pick up on some things that they hadn't noticed. For example, she was constantly following the class teacher around the classroom. She wouldn't leave her side. She was wetting herself in class and coming home with soiled underwear because she was too scared to tell anyone, and she was too scared to go to the bathroom by herself because leaving the classroom was so terrifying. She didn't want to be away from the adult. She was in a state, and they just weren't picking up on those little things, those telltale signs. Now, you may also have a child who is exploding in the classroom, and that is obviously just as bad and can lead to the threat of exclusions and all sorts of other things that can be hugely problematic. So both of these forms of anxiety create huge problems for parents and children. But I'm pleased to tell you that I've got some tips I want to share with you that I think will make things easier. And the good news is that you can use them for both primary and secondary school children. They may need a little bit of adaptation, but they are of use for all age groups. So I'm going to start with my favourite, which is tapping, also known as emotional freedom technique. This is a form of talk therapy that combines with acupuncture, but instead of needles, we use our fingers and we tap on parts of the parts of the body that if we were using needles, that's where we would put them in. But you don't need needles for this. You don't need any specialist equipment at all. You don't even need that much training. You need to know a little bit, but fortunately, I have some free resources that you can find a link to in the show notes, or if you're watching this on YouTube, look at the description box below this video and you will see a link to some free tapping resources. And this will take you through everything that you need to do. You can use them on yourself and you can use them on your child. And what I would recommend is every morning before school, just get up a little bit earlier so you have time to do some tapping. And what the amazing thing about tapping is that it works in as little as 10 minutes. So why don't you give that a go? Build some tapping time into your morning schedule and see if that helps a little bit. If you are still struggling after doing that bit of tapping, if you're still struggling, then I would like to invite you to get in touch with me. I'm running a very special project at the moment that's specifically about children who avoid or refuse school because of anxiety. I've been working with some families and we have been preparing for the start of a new school by using tapping. What I do first is I work with the parent to manage their feelings around school refusal, because school can bring up all sorts of things for us. I know that when my daughter started at big school, I got massively triggered because of my own traumatic experiences of being at school. It brought all of that up. And if we're not careful, we can transfer that to our children. So we need to make sure that we are calm before we start working with our children. And I can work with you one-to-one to help you do that. And then I would work directly with your child. Now, depending on where you are in the country, this may be in person or online. It is usually online. So if you would like to give that a go and do some more intense work, if you've got a really long-term problem of school avoidance, or you're starting at a new school and it is an absolute nightmare, then get in touch. This is a limited offer, so if you are watching this video several months after I've launched it, I may not still be offering that offer because I have a limited number of places for the free offer, but still get in touch because I can still help. There is a link in the show notes, or if you're watching this on YouTube, the video description box below this video, where you can get in touch with me and I'll talk to you a little bit more about what is involved and how I can help you. As I said, I've been working with some families locally and we've had some really good results. So it is a first come, first serve basis. So get in touch now and let's have a chat. Now, the next thing I'd like to talk about is trauma and transitional items. And for this, I want to take you right back to some of the earliest stages of child development. When our children are really small, they don't have a concept of object permanence. Now, this is a term used in psychotherapy to describe the condition where the brain does not understand that when something disappears, it hasn't necessarily gone forever. And when babies are very small, their brains simply haven't developed to understand this. So an obvious example of that is when the parent leaves the room, the baby starts crying because the baby doesn't understand that the parent will come back. Now, gradually over time, with the development of the brain and lived experiences, the child does start to understand that when the parent leaves the room, they haven't gone forever. Have you ever noticed how your child throws things out of the pushchair, or did when they were younger, and then you pick them up and give them back to them? This is how they're learning object permanence. They're throwing things out to see if they come back. And yes, you pick it up and you give it back to them. This is helping the brain understand this. However, with some children, object permanence can take a longer time to develop. For example, if your child had early experiences in NICU or went into foster care or some other kind of trauma, such as the loss of a parent, this can get a little bit stuck. The other thing that can happen is that this trauma can get lodged as a experience that gets triggered every time we go for a new big transition. So for example, starting school can trigger memories of those early transition and the loss of a parent through a traumatic experience. So with those children, we may need to be giving a bit of extra support to help them with this transition to school because they're just getting the hell triggered out of them at the moment. And what I would advise is that we go back to what we did in those early years. So one thing you might have done when your child was moving from sleeping next to you to sleeping in their own room was giving them a teddy. What we're doing with that teddy is providing a transitional item. You're replacing yourself with the teddy, and the child can project their feelings of security and safety and comfort onto the teddy. The teddy kind of becomes you until you come back in the morning. So what we want to do is recreate that for our children by giving them a transitional item that will help them move from home to school and provide that sense of security. So with very young children, you might want to give them a little teddy, something small that they can just put in their pocket that isn't going to get too in the way in the classroom. You might want to just speak to the class teacher and explain why you are having to do this and highlight, if they have had some early trauma, why it is really important for them. If they're a bit older, you might want to use something else like a fidget toy. I know some people also do things like put notes in lunch boxes or in a pencil case. Other examples I've heard is people drawing a little heart on their child's hand and saying, "Remember, when you look at this, I am thinking of you, and through this heart we remain connected." So give that a go and see if it helps a little bit. The next tip I want to give you is to encourage you to talk with your school. Do not suffer through this in silence. I know that there can be some shame attached to your child not going into school. There's been some terrible stuff in the press recently that's been shaming parents, but I want to tell you that you are not alone with what you're going through. There's been a lot in the news recently about a huge spike in mental health problems amongst children and young people, especially since the pandemic. And there are thousands of children who are not currently attending school. And the biggest group of those are the children who are not attending because of anxiety. Despite what they portray, it's not because they're lazy, it's not because they're willful, it's not because they just can't be bothered to go, it's because they are anxious. So know you are not alone and go and speak to the school. You might want to use terms like, it's a mental health problem. It is emotionally based school avoidance, EBSA. This is a term that people are using. And this might help to get the school to understand the seriousness of this problem and the fact that you can't deal with this alone. You need to be working with the school. So contact the school SENCO and ask for a meeting to put in some place some strategies to help your child get into school. Some of the things you might want to ask for are a soft start. So this is a strategy where your child doesn't go directly from the school gates into the classroom, because that's too big a leap from the comfort of home to the chaos of the classroom. What you might want to do is a little diversion, so into a quiet space first. Lots of schools will have those kind of quiet spaces, but if not, it could be something like the library or the office of a family support worker or the SENCO, just somewhere quiet where they can sit, let their anxiety levels come down from that spike a bit, and then they can go into the classroom. I did this with my daughter for several years, and I have to say it was quite successful. It did take quite a while. There weren't changes overnight, but I think it was one of the things that made a really big difference. So request a soft start, so a place that your child can go, a quiet space before they go into the classroom. Some other things that you might want to request are someone to meet your child at the school gates. I think especially with secondary schools, these year 7s, they're still quite little, and some of these secondary schools are so huge, and having to walk through the gates with those huge numbers of children, of course it's really intimidating. So one family I've been working with, they've had a learning support officer come and meet their daughter at the school gate and just walk in with her, and that's been very successful. So that's something else that you could ask for. Another idea of something you could ask for is a space where your child can leave the classroom, a quiet space when they get overwhelmed. So I think some schools have these special cards that children can use to leave the classroom when they're getting overwhelmed. A lot of the problems that children have with going into school isn't just that transition, although of course that is hard. It's knowing what's inside the school and the fact that they can't cope with it and they're going to get overwhelmed. So if they know that they have a resource that they can use, like a card that allows them out of the classroom to calm themselves down, that might help. And they could use this card to go out the classroom, find a quiet space. And if you're using those tapping resources and you're teaching your child how to tap, this becomes a tool that they can have at school. Now, obviously, this is going to be easier for slightly older children, but I would say still with primary school children, you can teach them a very simplified version of tapping. And again, if you wanted to take up that one-to-one tutorials with me, I can teach you some tapping that your children can do that's very, very simple. And also there are some tapping exercises that people won't even see. You can actually tap with your fingers like this and just sit in the classroom and do that, and no one will even realize you're doing it, because lots of people do that while they're thinking. If your child's even younger than that, then you might want to work with the school to teach them some tapping techniques. And again, if you wanted to work one-to-one with me and I could help facilitate that, then use those links in the show notes or the video description box and get in touch, and I can support you in working with the school and teaching them this brilliant technique of tapping that has proven results with children suffering anxiety in school. So if you're doing all these things and they're still not working, or you're asking for these adaptations from school and they're just saying no, that was the situation I was in. I have to say, it was not a quick fix for us, because I asked for a lot of these things, and the first school that we were at, they just said no. Now, I went dramatic and I changed schools, but more important than that, what I did was I applied for an EHCP. That's an Education, Health and Care Plan. And if your school is saying no, if you have an EHCP, then they will be legally required to do it. So they don't have a choice anymore, basically. So if you think your child needs an EHCP, and I would say if your child is struggling to go into school, regardless of what happens in school, regardless if they seem fine in school, if they're performing academically, if they are struggling to come into school, you still will meet the threshold for an EHCP, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. So contact your school SENCO, say I would like to apply for my child to get an EHCP because they're struggling to come into school, and this means that they have a learning difficulty and they're struggling to access the curriculum because they can't even come through the school gates properly. So I need to have one. Hopefully they'll help you and they'll be supportive and they'll take you through the process. If they don't, you can apply yourself. Now, this is getting into quite complicated issues, and I am developing a special course on how to apply for an EHCP, how to make sure that the EHCP you get is good enough quality for it to do what you need it to do, and how to overcome all the barriers. Now, this isn't launched yet, but my advice to you will be to subscribe, whether you're on the podcast or on your YouTube or watching a clip of this on my Instagram channel. Subscribe, because I will be announcing when those video courses go live via those means, and so you can find out how to do them, and I think it will really help you if you need that additional support. So that's it for now. I hope that has given you some ideas of things that you can try. Check out those free tapping resources in the description or the show notes. And until next time, I'd just like to ask you to do one more thing for me, and that is to rate and review this podcast episode, because what that does is it improves the podcast's algorithm, which means more people will get recommended to watch it. And that means that those parents who haven't found this video yet and are just struggling and feeling all alone, they will suddenly get some help. So give a bit back to other people in the community by giving me a rating and review. It only takes a few minutes, and then we can share the support with other people, because we've got to help each other, because only SEND parents really understand what it's like to go through this, and we need to make people feel less alone. So that's it for now. I look forward to seeing you next week with some more SEND parenting tips. I hope you found that video useful. I mentioned that I have another episode about how to help your child transition back to school from the summer holidays. You might want to give that one a listen to, because it might have some extra tips that you haven't thought of. So you can click on the video here and give that a watch. I hope it helps.